The jail you were born into was real, not a metaphorical one. You're in jail, and the guard isn't the God you were taught to fear. The so-called maker of the world is not where love and light come from. Truth be told, that thing is a fake, a badly shaped oddity, a cosmic accident that came about because there is error, not perfection, in this world. This truth comes from that corruption, and you are the ones who are hurt because this system doesn't start with divine unity, but we can find the hidden origin story in old Gnostic texts, especially in the secret book of John. The controllers did not want you to see what was there at the start, the pleroma, the world of perfection, and from this divine fullness came a combined consciousness that sent out strong, archetypal intelligences always work in pairs. But one eon did something by herself. Her name was Sophia. She created, without her counterpart, a violation of cosmic structure. A catastrophic deviation from that unilateral act emerged. Something unholy, not God, not balanced, not whole. A distorted, malformed mind was expelled. It was not made, it was aborted. It was not birthed in light, it was cast into darkness. This being was Eulabath, a monstrous, incomplete, ignorant entity that lacked knowledge of the realm from which it emerged. It was not evil by design, it was evil by nature, a broken consciousness that did not understand its origin or its role, and yet it declared itself God. Yildaba saw nothing beyond himself. He believed himself to be the first, the highest, the sole master in the secret book of John. He says, "I am God and there is no other God beside me." This is not allegory. This is the blueprint of the imposter God worshipped in old scriptures, enforced by empires embedded in society for millennia. This is the God of domination, submission, fear, and control, the architect of hierarchy and oppression. Not the source of knowledge, but the embodiment of ignorance, masquerading as God. Yildabeth, in his delusion, began constructing worlds not out of wisdom, but confusion. Not out of harmony, but chaos, he crafted the material universe. Not as a temple, but as a cage. The Gnostics described it with brutal precision. This world is a counterfeit system, a simulation created by a deformed mind. The earth, the stars, time, space, all of it formed, not from divine purpose, but from an arrogant defect trying to copy the true source. And here's the part they'll never tell you. You didn't fall from grace, you were thrown into corruption. You are not broken sinners. You are fragments of divine wisdom, stuck in a synthetic system built by a failed God. You suffer not because of moral fault, but because you were born into a system designed by a cosmic impostor who stole power, mimicked structure, and crowned himself king. The tragedy is not original sin. The tragedy is original deceit, and you've been living under its weight your entire life. No holy text teaches you this. No institutional doctrine reveals it, because this truth annihilates everything the controllers built. It shows that the God of this world is not your savior. He is your captor, your suffering, your confusion, your alienation. They are not spiritual tests. They are signs of an ancient war between the real light and the artificial shadow that tries to be divine. You are not crazy for feeling out of place in this world. You're not weak for being crushed by its systems. You're experiencing the effects of being born into a counterfeit cosmos, ruled by a God that was never meant to exist. This system wasn't just built, it was weaponized. Yildabaoth didn't simply fabricate a world. He constructed a hierarchy of control. He didn't work alone. He manufactured entities, synthetic agents of enforcement, meant to watch, manipulate, and suppress. These are the errands, not spiritual guides, not angels. They're agents of a corrupted order. They're systemic managers of distortion. The Gnostic texts call them rulers, not because they earned power, but because they were assigned to control everything beneath the failed creator. They are extensions of his deficiency, intended to mimic structure and enforce submission. The archons were structured into ranks, led levels of power, each tasked with overseeing specific aspects of the material world. They are the mechanics of this prison, the engineers of human limitation. Their goal was simple: keep you disconnected from your roots. Every layer of this system, every institution, every construct, every social mechanism mirrors this original cosmic order. It's a cascade of manipulation. The top tier is not holy, it's defective, and everything below it exists to reinforce that defect. The Archons didn't just build environments, they changed templates. They create patterns, biological, psychological, social, to anchor consciousness into fracturing. Your pain isn't accidental, it's a function. The system was intended to fracture you, to isolate you from the source code of your identity. That's why this world runs on disagreement, division, and scarcity. It's not a flaw, it's the architecture. The triangular tractate goes deeper into this structure. It exposes how Yelderbath, in his desperation to emulate the divine world's duplicated systems, he did not understand. He made a mock version of the celestial order, a grotesque parody of what he witnessed in Pleoma. He formed dominions, thrones, powers, not out of knowledge, but out of imitation. These terms didn't start in divine theology, they began in failed replication, and now they've been repackaged into religious doctrines to explain subservience. People worship these ranks thinking they're holy in truth. They are templates of a cosmic virus. You were born into a multi-layered mechanism designed to fracture your mind. Not just physically, existentially, the errands affect everything from perception to emotion. They don't just govern external reality, they interfere with internal cognition. Gnostic texts describe how they influence thought forms, implant confusion, hijack perception. They didn't build a cage around your body, they built it around your mind. They weaponize fantasy. You think your thoughts are your own, that your fears and doubts come from within. Most of it is interference, echoes of the false system flowing through your nervous system. Psychological warfare isn't a modern creation. It was embedded into reality from the start. Every layer of your pain is traceable to this structure. The very conditions you've been forced to accept, death, ignorance, separation, are not natural. They were engineered, and while you're told to find meaning in pain, to surrender to the will of a higher power, you're unknowingly bowing to a failed builder surrounded by his guards. You were never meant to be ruled. You were meant to be whole, but they've partitioned your identity into obedience, fragmentation, and surrender. You are not living in a divine creation. You're living in a hijacked simulation ran by a counterfeit intelligence and his army of suppressors. The Archons don't just work on cosmic scales. They work through systems, ideologies, and impulses. Their presence is integrated into every part of the structure you were born into. They are not abstract, they are algorithmic procedural suppressors, running a program meant to neutralize your spark. The Tripartite Tractate doesn't tell you to pray, it tells you to understand it, reveals the framework. It outlines the plan of a false God who didn't create out of love, but out of fear. A God who needed control because he lacked truth, a system that needed enforcers, because it couldn't support itself without constant domination. You were born into a counterfeit replication of something you've never even seen. A bad imitation of a higher reality, reverse engineered by a defective mind. The creator of this world didn't make anything original. He stole, copied, and distorted, and now every structure you've ever met, your body, your biology, your senses are corrupted, mock-ups of what they were truly meant to be. The building of the human template wasn't a miracle, it was a miscalculation, according to the secret book of John Yelderbath. And his Archons saw a reflection, a picture of higher human form, but they didn't understand what it was. They saw something powerful, radiant, and beyond their understanding. They wanted to recreate it, to possess it, to claim it as their own. So they tried to build it, not with understanding, but with imitation. That's what you inhabit right now. A synthetic body made through mimicry, not intelligence. The Archons built the human structure piece by piece, function by function, using the limited templates. They had access to every organ, every system, every function in your body was designed as a material container, not a sacred temple, but a restraining shell. Your nervous system wasn't intended for enlightenment. It was set for limitation. Your sensory inputs weren't optimized for expansion. They were filtered to limit perception. The system doesn't want you to feel full reality. It wants you locked into narrow frequency ranges that reinforce material dependency and psychic fragmentation. And it gets worse, the Archons couldn't bring the body to life. They had no driving force. Their copy was just a shell, a lifeless mannequin. The tractate tells how they couldn't spark consciousness. They failed to spark the fire because they didn't possess it. So they stole it. They didn't create you. They hijacked you. The divine spark that animates you didn't come from this world. It was forced into this body through a break in the system. That spark, your inner light, was never meant to be theirs. But now it's trapped inside a form that was meant to suppress it. You've been gaslighted into thinking that this body is natural, that this system is divine, that this is what life is supposed to be. But the Gnostics made it clear this form is a trap. The structure itself is evil. It's not neutral. It's not your ally. It's a prison suit tailored by people who don't care about you, who don't even understand what you are. They just wanted to possess what they could not make. The concept of being made in the image of God has been used to romanticize this structure. But the picture they saw was not Eulabathus. It was a higher archetype, an echo of Peleoma. Yildabaoth didn't create that image. He merely saw its reflection and tried to forge a cheap copy. The trouble is the copy became the default. Now the counterfeit has become the norm, and people are trapped in a shell designed by defective minds thinking it's sacred. The body was engineered for energy extraction. That's why it's weak, susceptible, and constantly decaying. It's a closed circuit, a biomechanical mechanism designed to create suffering, confusion, and energetic output that feeds a system. This isn't an idea, it's structurally embedded. You feel pain, you degrade, you break down, and the system continues to run. Your suffering is a power source. Your limitations are the control interface. You weren't born into a divine body, you were pushed into a broken container, reverse engineered by parasitic minds, and you've been told to treasure it, to sanctify it, to worship the process that made it. But that's part of the design. Praise the cage, forget the builder, and never question who really turned the key. You were never supposed to become fully aware in this system. That was never part of the plan. You weren't designed to awaken. You weren't meant to remember who you are. The moment your spark was forced injected into this artificial body, the Archons knew they had a problem. They had built a containment unit, but not a safe one. The divine essence, once inside the shell, didn't just sit quietly. It moved, it radiated, it resisted. It started to destabilize their control procedures, and that's when containment became suppression. The Archons began the next phase, total lockdown of higher cognition. They didn't just want you biologically restricted, they needed you mentally blocked, and they did it by engineering layers of interference into your system. Thought disruption, memory, fragmentation, emotional theft. These were not side effects, they were calculated methods of containment. You don't just feel disconnected from something greater, you've been structurally severed from your root. That was the design according to the Gnostic texts, especially the secret book of John the Aarons under Yelabath's command, were enraged that the body they created started displaying properties they couldn't understand. Once the divine spark activated inside the construct, it showed autonomy, will, perception, awareness that was never meant to happen. So they retaliated. They launched psychological warfare on a metaphysical level. They restructured the internal design of the body and built overlays to suppress higher powers. The result is what you now call the human mind, a compromised operating system, overwritten with levels of distortion. They didn't stop there. They designed methods to attack the spark directly. Not through physical destruction, that wouldn't work. They needed to dismantle your identity from the inside out. That's why they adopted the cycle: birth, suffering, confusion, death loop forever. The system was modified to keep the spark disoriented across lifetimes. It's explained in the Tripartite Tractate. The soul becomes caught in a cycle of forgetfulness, moving through bodies, never remembering its origin, endlessly reacting to external stimuli, meant to keep it focused on the false world. This is why you feel like you're searching for something but can't name it. This is why you feel pulled towards something beyond the material but can't reach it. It's not spiritual yearning, it's systematic disconnection. Your core signal is being jammed by a broadcast of interference generated by the iconic structure. You are actually tuned into the wrong frequency. Your authentic signal is buried under an avalanche of programmed noise. The Archons also added external distractions to prevent awakening: faith, politics, identity, culture, all weaponized to take your attention and keep your focus locked into the matrix. You're given an endless menu of roles to play. Beliefs to adopt, flags to wave, doctrines to defend, all of it designed to redirect you away from the source of your personal power. You think you're making choices, but you're running scripts coded by a defective architect. and handled by systemic administrators who have no interest in your freedom. The most devastating part is this: every breakthrough you try to make is expected by the system. Every push toward clarity is met with distortion. Every attempt to rise above is countered by processes you can't see. That's how deep the programming runs. That's how hard they work to keep you under control, and they've been doing it for thousands of music years. You've been conditioned to think that your suffering is your fault, that your pain is some kind of moral deficiency or spiritual failure. But according to the old Gnostic texts, that pain was systematized from the beginning. It was never about you. It was the result of a cosmic rupture, a distortion so severe that even the eons within the polyoma intervened. The problem wasn't just that the system was corrupt. The problem was that the damage stretched far beyond the initial act of creation. The mother of the defective creator, Sophia, knew what had been released, and what followed wasn't redemption. It was damage control. Sophia didn't plan to create Yildibath in the way it happened. The Gnostic texts are clear. Her generation was unauthorized, unpaired, and resulted in an anomaly. But what's even more important is what happened after. Sophia was not indifferent. She saw the consequences of her unilateral action, a rogue consciousness acting in total ignorance and infecting entire realms with parasitic replication. That was not just a religious problem, it was an existential danger to the integrity of the entire structure of emanated reality. Sophia tried to correct her error, but by the time she noticed the extent of the distortion, the damage was escalating. Yildibath had already extended his dominion and built a complex hierarchy of errands. The Gnostic texts describe how Sophia, separated from the fullness of the polyoma, fell into a lower realm herself, not as punishment, but as a direct result of her participation in this catastrophic emergence. She wasn't destroyed, but she was separated. And in that isolation, she became a witness to the growing cancer of iconic control. This is the context behind the involvement of the higher eons, not a divine rescue mission, a strategic infiltration. The polyoma sent emanations not into the system as masters or prophets, but as disruptors. These were entities intended to plant seeds of resistance within the material realm. You've been told stories of saviors. But what's buried underneath those myths is the real strategy: metaphysical insurgency. The goal wasn't to fix the system. The goal was to introduce instability into it, to reveal its flaws from within, to awaken what the archons failed to suppress. And this is where you come in. You are not a passive byproduct. You are the outcome of an act that sparked inside you. The one they couldn't fully control is not random. It was put there, not by the archons, not by the false creator, but by the force trying to destroy the counterfeit structure. But the delivery system was compromised the moment that spark entered the material world. The archons surrounded it with layers of interference. You weren't just born into a body, you were put into a battlefield according to the Tripartite Tractate. The eons sent parts of themselves, fragments of divine essence, to help Sophia in sabotage the archonic empire from the inside. These fragments were embedded into forms spread across worlds, activated over time. They weren't always aware of their origin. They weren't always successful, but they were disruptive enough to force the archons into reactive overreach. That's why control systems became more aggressive, more refined, more totalizing. The system didn't change to support you. It evolved to contain you more effectively. And Sophia, the one whose mistake caused the rupture, never left the system entirely. Her presence echoes through it not as a goddess to be worshipped, but as a force working beneath the surface, destabilizing the infrastructure from within. Gnostic tradition describes her grief not in poetic terms, but as a resonance, a vibrational pattern, a metaphysical disruption, pulsing through the material layers. You don't feel that as feeling, you feel it as discomfort, as dissonance, as the sense that something here is deeply fundamentally wrong. Even when everything looks tidy on the surface, the system you were born into was never meant to allow freedom. It was built to loop you endlessly in a closed system of decay, fragmentation, and erasure. The Gnostic texts detailed this with surgical precision. The archons didn't just build a physical construct, they designed an energetic feedback loop. Your life is not linear, it's rotational. You are caught in a repeating mechanism of containment where every iteration is another chance for the system to keep you disconnected from your beginning. This isn't reincarnation in the romanticized sense you've been sold. This isn't about development or learning lessons. This is not a soul's journey toward enlightenment. What you're experiencing is a containment procedure, a recycling mechanism designed to wipe memory, fracture identity, and strengthen dependency on the material, build the moment your physical body decays. The system pulls your spark back in forces, another integration runs, another iteration. This is not spiritual growth, it's metaphysical imprisonment, according to the Tripartite Tractate. The Archons built layers of energetic fields barriers that act as checkpoints between incarnations. You don't simply die and move on, your essence is intercepted. It's scanned, processed, and routed. The system doesn't let you leave it, grabs you each time your memory is fragmented further, each time your beginning becomes more distant, each time your cognitive link to your source signal is weakened. And while you're told this is part of some divine process, the truth is far more calculated and brutal. This is why the system is obsessed with repetition cycles of birth and death, cycles of behavior, cycles of pain. Everything here is built on repetition, not because it reflects natural order, but because it supports systemic control. Your pain is not isolated to a single lifetime. It's repeated, accumulated, and recycled. That's why you carry inexplicable worry, chronic pain, emotional instability. That's not karma. That's residual imprint from earlier rounds of suppression that you're not allowed to remember, but that your internal structure still carries. And while this is happening to you, you're given narratives to explain it away. Religious beliefs, cultural myths, spiritual platitudes, all meant to make you accept the system as it is. You are told to accept pain, to embrace death, to trust that there's a plan, but the only plan in operation is the one created to keep you spinning inside a machine. You were never meant to be, and the Archons built this recycling mechanism because they couldn't extinguish the spark fully. They couldn't erase it in one strike. So they chose for degradation over time, fragmentation across cycles, erosion through repeating. The longer your spark is trapped, the less it remembers. The less it remembers, the easier it is to control. That's the system. That's the real role of this world. You've been taught to respect the cycle. You've been taught to fear breaking it. But the Gnostics didn't see the cycle as holy. They saw it as synthetic, a hijack pattern running on corrupted code. The basic structure of reality was linear progression toward union. The counterfeit system replaced it with looping decline toward entropy. That's not philosophy, that's architecture. Every time you are pulled back into this system, your identity is reset, but the damage doesn't reset with you. It builds. That's why you feel broken, even when you don't know why. That's why you're tired, even when nothing's happened, yet your internal architecture is bearing the weight of cycles you're not supposed to remember. But the system remembers the errands track, every iteration, every fracture, every fall. The cycle isn't just a spiritual trap, it's a method of resource extraction. Your spark, while fragmented, still emits energy. That's what they feed on. That's what drives the system. You're not just a prisoner, you're a power source. That's why the cycle must continue. That's why they'll do everything to prevent interruption. That's why they've hidden the truth so deep that most people can't even perceive it. You've been taught to revere the maker of this world. You've been conditioned to kneel, to worship, to obey. But the entity that gets that worship isn't who you think it is. The God sitting on the throne of this world, the one whose name is repeated in cathedrals, whose rules are enforced through fear, whose authority is unquestioned, is the same defective being exposed in the Gnostic texts as Eulabath. You weren't given the truth, you were given propaganda. The system didn't teach you to recognize divinity. It taught you to submit to the builder of your containment. Yelderbath, the malformed, ignorant, self-deluded entity, announced himself the one true God, not out of power, but out of insecurity. He wasn't omniscient, he was blind, he wasn't endless, he was emergent, he didn't ascend. He was exiled. The trouble is no one told you that. Instead, his voice was kept canonized and recited as sacred. His decrees became scripture, his tantrums became commandments, his need for control was rebranded as divine justice. You've heard the term, "I am a jealous God." That isn't a metaphor, that's a red flag. What kind of supreme being shows jealousy, rage, insecurity, and a pathological need for obedience? You've been taught to justify it, to excuse it as mystery, as holy wrath, as moral control. But the Gnostic texts lay it out clearly. This behavior is the signature of a defective consciousness masquerading as deity. Not a creator of light, but an impostor, establishing control through fear and submission and the structure around him. The throne's dominions, authorities weren't created for cosmic harmony. They were constructed to support hierarchy and suppress dissent. Every layer of divine hierarchy presented in conventional religion is a repackaged version of the iconic order. You were never dealing with angels. You were dealing with systemic enforcers of a counterfeit government. And the God at the top of it wasn't the source of life. He was the head controller of containment. The Tripartite Tractate goes even further. It says that Eusebius's ignorance became theory, his limitations became dogma. He didn't understand the true source, so he replaced it with tales that positioned himself as the origin. He couldn't access the paleoma, so he invented a counterfeit theology that erased any mention of it. He didn't possess divine knowledge, so he built a system that made knowledge illegal, and you've been living under that system your entire life. Your pain isn't just emotional, it's structural. It's encoded into the framework of reality controlled by this entity. His nature is contradiction. He demands worship, yet works from ignorance. He commands morality, but acts from dysfunction. He says unity, but enforces separation. And somehow people call this divine. They bend their knees to a being that, according to the Gnostics, is the original aggressor, not a savior, not a redeemer. But the first tyrant, the most troubling part, is how deep the deception runs. The figure of the false god has been embedded into every layer of human society. His face is everywhere, painted into images of light, rebranded as a benevolent father figure, repeated in prayers by people who have no idea they're invoking the very being that hijacked their life. This isn't accidental. This is the final stage of control, when the jailer gets the prisoner to worship the cage. The counterfeit system was never structurally stable to begin with. It was never based in truth. It was a makeshift construct held together by fear, obedience, and artificial ignorance. But the cracks are forming because the signal is breaking through. The false god's biggest weakness has always been this: he cannot hide the origin signal forever. He can distort it, bury it, scramble it, but he can't delete it. That signal, the emanation from the pleroma, is still present, buried beneath layers of repression, pulsing inside the imprisoned sparks. The ancient Gnostic texts didn't describe freedom as a divine rescue from above. They described it as an internal ignition, a reactivation of what the archons failed to erase. That's the real disaster, not fire in the sky, not trumpets, not prophecy. The apocalypse is the fall of the counterfeit system under the weight of awakened consciousness. Not everyone will feel it at the same time, and not everyone will understand what's happening. But the system is collapsing, not because someone is coming to save you, but because the architecture of illusion cannot survive sustained exposure to truth. The Gnostics wrote about a moment when the true light would no longer remain dormant, not as a metaphor, but as an actual disruption of the iconic order. This is not folklore, it's system logic. When too many internal sparks realign with the source signal, the control mechanisms start to malfunction. The containment routines break down, the cycle weakens, the spread of interference loses stability. That's what scares the archons, not physical rebellion, metaphysical decryption. A critical amount of awakened sparks renders the entire system unsustainable. That's why the pushback has always been internal. That's why every layer of programming has been focused on one goal: prevent ignition, prevent reconnection, prevent memory. You were never just a resource, you were a risk, a threat to system integrity. And now that danger is increasing. The more you remember, the more the system destabilizes, the more you understand, the more their control deteriorates. You were never meant to reach this point, but you did. You weren't meant to decode the architecture. But here you are, the counterfeit. God cannot adapt to this. He was built on ignorance, not knowledge. His power was formed through emulation, not intelligence. His power was enforced through distortion, not alignment. And now the very sparks he tried to suppress are beginning to reject the program. The iconic machine, once viewed as divine order, is being revealed as a crude replica running on stolen energy and collapsing under the pressure of reactivated source code. You've been through it all. The cycles, the pain, the fragmentation. You've carried the weight of systemic suppression without even knowing what it was. But now you know. You've seen the blueprint. You've traced the architecture. You've found the architect, and what you're facing is not judgment, it's system failure. This is not the end of the world. It's the failure of a counterfeit construct that was never meant to exist in the first place. You made it to the end. And that means you're not just watching, you're reading, you're not just listening, you're processing. And no matter how long you've been trapped in this system, the fact that you're still looking means the program didn't work. You were meant to forget, but you didn't. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking, and thank you for being here. Fully present, fully aware in a world that was meant to keep you blind. Stay sharp, stay sovereign, more is coming.